And because of the way it turned out, I'd say most historians would take the view that the Versailles Peace Treaty was a total failure. The harsh conditions that imposed on Germany were one of the contributing factors for the eventual rise of the Nazi Party, for a deep level of discontent in Germany that the Nazi Party was able to exploit, that Adolf Hitler was able to exploit. The other big failure was that while Wilson had this great idea of a League of Nations, he was not able to get the US Congress, and particularly the US Senate, to agree to it. So you had a body that had been conceptualized by a US president, didn't have much enthusiastic support from European powers, and it didn't have any presence of the United States at all. And you had European powers that continued to try to pursue imperialist policies, maintaining control of empires, mercantilist trade policies that restricted international trade and kept the benefits of economic development limited to themselves and not to the rest of the world where they had influence and control. And so it took another World War, essentially, to try to move to a next phase in a global framework. The Second World War obviously proceeded in a very different way, and with much deeper involvement by the United States. At its conclusion, it left the United States again in a very strong position. It left the European powers in a much weaker position than they had been after the First World War. Not only were they exhausted by war, not only were they dealing with the need to rebuild, to reconstruct, they were also dealing with colonial possessions that were much less willing to go along with the arrangements that they had, with independence movements in their colonial possessions that were gaining strength and not willing to just continue on in the old ways. So the United States again proposed a new framework for the world. There were several parts of this framework. The United Nations was the basic concept, and this time the United States was very much a part of it. It included a Security Council within the United Nations that had a limited number of permanent members, the countries that had won, had victory in the Second World War, and then a range of rotating members. But the Security Council basically with the job of trying to maintain the peace, trying to prevent the outbreak of another major world conflict. I mean, you look at the level of destruction in the Second World War and how widespread it was, you can understand that there was a very strong desire, shared desire, not to repeat that experience. And so this time around we had an organization, the United Nations, that had very, very widespread participation and had some stronger institutional arrangements, a stronger framework to make decisions and to enforce decisions. Along with those, there was a number of economic institutions created. The International Monetary Fund, known as the IMF, was charged with trying to ensure that currencies' values remained stable, and that financial flows remained stable, and that member countries pursued sound financial policies. The World Bank and a number of regional multilateral development banks were created to try to mobilize resources for reconstruction. So initially a strong focus on Europe and Japan in lending for rebuilding and reconstruction. There was also an effort to try to establish an organization to manage global trade. That effort did not initially succeed, and so what we had from the end of the war for about 40 years was a treaty known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. The unifying concept for all of these, what they all had in common, was an attempt to introduce an international framework where relations and the conduct of business was not based so much on power. It wasn't whoever was strongest gets to make the decision, but rather to introduce the idea that there should be a rule of law, that there should be common rules that the countries who belong to these organizations would all abide by. And when it comes to the United Nations, the concept of maintaining peace and not interfering, not invading your neighbor. When it comes to the IMF, the concept of keeping your currency values stable, not trying to manipulate your finances to your advantage, but unfairly to disadvantage the people that you do business with. And in the GATT, in this treaty, the concept that there would be trade rules that we would all abide by. And the big motivation on trade, I think the thing that was fresh in the minds of the people who launched the negotiations to make this agreement was the fact that in the late 20s and the early 30s, 1930s, when we had a financial crisis in the United States, a stock market crash, we had a depression of global scale, and one of the ways that people responded to an economic downturn was to raise barriers to trade. The idea was that, well, if we're not doing well, we need to protect our markets and our producers and our businesses and our farmers, and so we're going to raise tariffs. And the effect of that was to reduce trade, and when you reduce trade, then growth, it has a more adverse effect on growth. In other words, taking that kind of response to an economic downturn just made the downturn worse. It made the depression deeper and more intractable, more harder to pull ourselves back out of. And that economic depression, along with the harsh conditions that were imposed on Germany, along with a number of other factors, is what helped enable the rise of fascist political parties in Europe and brought us into a Second World War. So there's a strong desire in doing this to avoid repeating that experience, to avoid repeating the experience of depression, of trade wars, of increasing tensions leading to actual military conflict. That was the idea. To look at the results. In many ways, I think historians would say that it was successful. The concepts that they introduced, the framework they created, it succeeded in preventing a Third World War. But it also very quickly, that particularly the United Nations, became a battlefield for a different kind of war, the Cold War, the rivalry between Western powers and communist powers led by the Soviet Union. And that had, it's not something I think that was very well anticipated when they created these institutions. The effect of the Cold War, where you had, within the UN Security Council, on the one side Russia, and then eventually China, and then on the other side, America, Britain, and France, and then you had a deadlock emerging. Any decision that touched on core interests for either the West or the East, or the communist powers, you wouldn't be able to make any progress on that issue within the United Nations because of the deadlock between those powers, because of the Cold War tensions. And that's one of the reasons that over time, a lot of Americans became very, I think, were very disappointed in the United Nations, and have a feeling that the United Nations never lived up to its potential, never achieved the results that might have been hoped for. And so when I was about your age and when I was getting ready to become a diplomat, one of the big issues in the United States in foreign policy was, should we continue to support the United Nations? Should we continue to be involved or rely on the United Nations? And it's been an ongoing debate ever since. We've seen some instances where the U.S. has tried to work within the United Nations framework. And the most extreme examples, if you want to look at the first Gulf War in 1990, where the United States worked to mobilize support for that war within the UN framework and with a mandate, with the UN agreeing that yes, we need to roll back Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And then contrast that with a little over 10 years later in the second Iraq War, where the United States tried to get agreement within the United Nations to invade Iraq and failed, and went ahead anyway without such a mandate. I'd say for a lot of people in the United States, we'd use the expression that the jury is still out on the United States. We have different views about it, and if there are times when we're able to work within it and build a consensus to achieve results that we would like to achieve in the world, and there are other times when we don't, and we get frustrated with it. For the economic institutions that I spoke about a minute ago, for the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT, the story was a little different, because those institutions were based on more or less a capitalist concept of how the world would work, of a market-oriented concept of how the world would work. And communist countries did not join them. And so, as institutions, you did not have a presence of China and Russia. And so within an institution, and so the decision-making process, the decision for the IMF, what policies should we adopt as a group, or what kind of financial support should we give to countries that are having financial crises. Russia didn't stand in the way of that. China didn't stand in the way of that because they weren't in those institutions. And in the trade institution, or the same with multilateral development bank lending, they didn't block those decisions because they weren't there. In the trade sphere, in the GATT, similar arrangement. You had people continuing to negotiate new trade rules that we would all abide by, but those rules really only applied in the countries of the West and the developing countries that joined those institutions. And so, for better or worse, the United States, as it worked to try to strengthen its position in the Cold War and to gain support from developing countries,